of Decoupling, Managing the Movement Out of China and Exploring Sustainable Sourcing Strategies for Long-Term Success. The panel will be moderated by Ravi Dosanjh, COO of Caliber Global, who will introduce his fellow panel members to you. Ladies and gentlemen, please end these conversations and have your seats. Thank you.
Is there a sequence?
I think the room looks kind of light. Wink is giving away $1,000 to the first person that comes up to him.
All right.
You got to jump up on stage. He didn't
Hey,
tell you
folks in the break area, I can see you. Why don't you guys come to the ballroom over here? Slowly filtering in.
It's worse after lunch.
Yeah, I think we'll get started. Hey, so first of all, a lot of people have mentioned, the summit, the background. It's our 11th year. I think it is worth mentioning, again, from my standpoint, how impressed I am personally. This is my 6th year being involved in one form or another. And I do a lot of events through work and just some of my personal networking. And I would say this is one of the premier events that I look forward to every year. It's a great mix of academia and folks from industry. And I think Nick and company do a phenomenal job. So just a hand for Nick and and congrats to Gene for taking over the new position. So I think before we get into it, I'm going to pontificate a little bit, right? We talked about, why are we actually here, right? We have a mix of, academia, we have a mix of industry, we have, suppliers, customers. Like, what is our purpose and what are we doing here? I mean, really what our purpose is here is to speak to the students and, the folks with, the 11th cohort and any other folks that are, in academia that are, up and coming and are thinking about what their career in supply chain should look like, right? And some tips and tricks and, things that maybe some other folks with some experience have gone through. So, Nick, nicely framed the reprogramming. And I think one of the things that the cohort needs to acknowledge is in this era of reprogramming, where did this industry come from? Right, now I started off in this industry loading trucks. You have a lot of old timers in the room that'll remember this industry before we even called it supply chain, right? And that was a time when we didn't have a seat at the table, right? The CEO didn't know what supply chain, what shipping, logistics, what any of that stuff was. So fast forward through the pandemic, fast forward through people saying they've now realized how important it is. I think it's important for the up-and-comers to think about the responsibility they have, because you're now stepping in to a situation where everybody knows supply chain, right? CEOs know supply chain. You have chief supply chain officers reporting in directly. You have my kids talking about supply chain because their stuff wasn't getting in on time during the pandemic. My son actually blamed supply chain on not turning in his homework one time, but it's pervasive within everything we do, right? So with that, one more thing. Wherever you guys go, right, start thinking about how you can influence your ecosystem, right? So look, there are customer ecosystems, there are supplier ecosystems, right? Where are you gonna play? And how can you go in and not only bring in the knowledge that you've garnered through education, but how can you go and influence folks to do the right thing? If you're on the customer side, how do you do more than just incremental improvements and save money, right? Yes, you've got to play the game, and the game is driven by Wall Street and finance, but how do you do that better, right? How do you influence your stakeholders? Think about those things. If you're on the customer side, how do you partner, right? Not hoodwink, right? Not try to take advantage, but how do you partner with your customers so we can improve supply chain and break down silos? So anyway, that's a little bit of Ravi pontification there. So today, we are going to be talking about commerce and supply chain outlook from 2025 and beyond. And the reason why that's important is what do we see? What do we feel is going to happen? What's important? Where do we need help? Right? What's going to evolve? And we call it in the era of decoupling, and Nick is the one that actually coined that term, which is really interesting. Side note, I don't know how many times I've been watching TV and I'll see Nick Vyas, Noel Hasagawa, Gene Soroka on TV. That's amazing. And this is something that Nick had coined, right? And decoupling is kind of, pulling things apart, right? We're going into a global balance environment, ecosystems are changing, things have to decouple. So, first with the post-pandemic landscape and all of those geopolitical tensions and all of those things happening, right? The fact is that we're going to get into a global balance situation. So there is going to be some decoupling. And, I want to hear what folks on the stage here have to think about the importance of global balancing and kind of the impacts to the community. Second, where do we need help, right? So again, the folks here on the stage, they're actually involved. They're, I wouldn't say in the weeds, but they are impacted and they are managing some stakeholders to talk about what they're doing and what they need from the community. So I think there's some good learnings there. And third, the right capability at the right time. So again, folks that are coming into supply chain, no longer is the expectation going to be, hey, just on-time delivery, year-on-year, cost, cost, quality, availability, right? Those are standard things. Now it's going to be, you need to enable all capabilities that could be deployed at any time, right? So what do these guys think about it? So to best represent, I think you guys have done hearing from me, but to best represent these thoughts, who do I rely on? Who do I personally call and who do I respect? It's these guys right here. Frank Sanders, Vice President, Global Procurement at Cisco. Frank's a mentor of mine. Yeah. And, Frank has kind of progressed through, technical leadership to executive leadership, worked at companies like Intel, AWS, and now Cisco, right? So very, very well versed in this environment. We have Perry Hyder, Director, Facilities, Logistics, and Construction at Google. So under Perry's leadership, all of the category orchestration for those things I mentioned falls under Perry. And I think at the end of the day, it's cost, quality, availability. It's on time and full. It's making sure you're making it happen. That's a lot. That's a big responsibility. Bar-Ner, Director, Construction Supply Chain at Intel. So there's a thing called IDM 2.0 at Intel. We can get into that in a bit. It's basically $150 billion of construction spending. And this guy's on the hook to orchestrate that, right, in different ways through global supply chain operations. So welcome to the stage. John Berry, Senior Vice President, Information Technology at OEC. I've worked with John for many years. What I like about John is he comes from industry, right? So as a techie that speaks a language that sometimes I don't speak, I know he speaks my language. He knows what a box looks like. He knows what customers need, right? Knows what the inside of a plane, a steamship looks like. So it's really helpful. So John's responsible for, ecosystems, right? And he drives improvement for his customers through managing, OEC's logistics ecosystem, but also the customer's ecosystem, right? And making those connections. And last but not least, we have PG Go, professor at the National University of Singapore. So PG is responsible for thought leadership at the NUS, ensuring that his students get a good understanding, similar to you guys, right? What is expected, what's going to happen, right? And where they can enable a difference within supply chain. I also like the fact that PG comes from industry also, spent some time on the forwarding side, so he's got some very practical knowledge in addition to the academic piece. So I'm your moderator, Ravi Dosanjh, COO, Caliber Global. Plug time. Caliber Global is a 4PL that focuses on supply chain. We basically manage anything that falls within supply chain spending for repositioning factories or new retail store locations or anything in between. So I had to put that plug in. We just got a Series A investment on Thursday. Very happy. Thank you for clapping. And now we'll go on to the discussion. So again, global balance, help needed, where things are going to evolve. So Frank, you've dealt with a lot of stuff in supply chain through your career, right? We're talking about global balance. Everyone's talking about global balance. What comes to your mind, man? Like, what are some of the things we should be thinking about?
Well, before I answer that question, I want to start with a joke. I've been watching the crowd from the back of the room, and we need more energy in this room. And by the way, I made this joke up, so bar low. So a kid walks into a toy store on his birthday, and it's the year 2021. And in the aisle where the toy that he wants is sitting, there's only one of that toy. And on the one end of the aisle, there's some random guy. And on the other end, there's the devil. So as the kid goes and reaches for that toy, the random guy just comes in and swoops and grabs it at the last minute. So all of a sudden, the kid just starts to cry. His parents look at the guy and they say, "How dare you? How in the world could you do this to the kid?" So the guy looks up sheepishly and he said, "Oh, the devil made me do it." And the devil said, "Oh, no. You can't put this one on me. Finally, I can put it on something else. It's a supply chain issue." So if you're in this room, you are guilty by association, whether you know it or not. And as we have all worked through the challenges that we've had to work through the last several years, it's felt a bit like that. And to your point, Ravi, you know, my family didn't know anything about supply chain. I'm sure a lot of the people that you guys engaged on a day-to-day basis, many people didn't know a lot about what you did, but all of a sudden it was in the limelight, and everything was that didn't work right was a result of failure in supply chain. And when we talk about things like globalization and global balance, the key thing is being able to balance efficiency with resiliency and agility. And quite frankly, when you think about the supply networks that we've developed, that we've enabled over time, we thought we were doing that. As a matter of fact, we thought we had a really optimized model. And when you think about the centralization or the concentration, a lot of our supply networks in certain geos, in large part, it was an efficiency play where we also had those other factors that allowed us to support the businesses that we're accountable for supporting. But the environmental factors, the unimaginable environmental factors of the last couple years have told us that we weren't doing that. And it really told us that we have to think differently about our risk. We have to start now looking at geoconcentration as a single dependency that we have to mitigate and put plans around in order to manage. And that's not easy to do. When you think about some of the actions and some of the things that have occurred. Yeah, on paper, it sounds great. But, you know, reshoring with all of the incentives, it's not a trivial thing. When you think about things at an aggregate level like access to the appropriate labor, replicating the quality that's been enabled and the capabilities that have been enabled elsewhere in different locations. Thinking about some of the cultural aspects. These are things that we have to manage and work through to enable that. We also have to recognize that if you think about the things that we were trying to manage and mitigate in the past versus the things that we've seen as of late, when we do our scenario planning, we have to think about what's the worst possible thing that can happen and then plan for something that's worse than that. We have to leverage the emerging capabilities, data, AI, et cetera, to allow us to improve our sensing, our forecasting, do more scenario planning and do it more efficiently, rely less on people to do that. And even if you think about the skill sets that we talked about, even the practitioners in our space, enabling them with the right tools and capabilities to be able to do that kind of work. But even with that, we will not, I'm very certain about this, be able to mitigate 100% of the things that come our way. And so the other thing that we have to be very cognizant of is how do we continue to build agility in our supply chains to be able to respond faster, shorten our supply chains when we're responding to disruptions that occur.
Yeah. You touched on two things there, Frank. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. You touched on a couple of things there. One is optimizing, and I would question whether that became a level of suboptimization, right? Not in your supply chain specifically, but just in general. Where do we start suboptimizing, right? The other thing that comes to mind is, it's the game we're playing, right? And, in that game we're playing, it's starting to get to the point where the C-suite has those expectations of many capabilities or any capabilities, all capabilities at all time, right? Which translates to the right need at the right time, right? And so there's a lot that needs to happen in there, and yeah, I think you articulated that really well. Look, as we start, you talked about reshoring, right? So as we start to think about, hey, what reshoring needs, and I'm a big believer that it's happening, right? Global balances is something that, whether we're nearshoring, reshoring, continue to reposition, it's happening, it's going to happen. I think, PG, my question for you is, where do you see the beneficiaries of this reshoring, right? Whether companies, industries, countries, like who's going to benefit for some of this global balance initiatives?
Sure. I think that there are two trends, right? So one is that you have this traditional just-in-case kind of supply chain, and I think just-in-time supply chain and cost-cutting and optimization, right? And you kind of talked about the sub-optimization. So when we had all these disruptions, especially during COVID, then the global supply chain couldn't cope. So that's the first impact, right? That caused all these changes. And of course, now you had the geopolitical tensions. And I would say that the third component is also technology. So technology has improved a lot, right? So when you think about the from a global supply chain point of view, I think there are two things to think about, right? When you think about the reshoring or movement of supply chains to new manufacturing locations. On one hand, there's domestic markets. So traditionally, it's like, okay, make in Asia for cheap, and then we ship to the more developed markets like the US. But now we have cases where investments into India or Indonesia is for domestic market production. So traditionally, it might be, oh, let's make in China, and then we ship to India or we ship to the Southeast Asian markets because that creates economies of scale. But now, because of diversification, some of these large domestic markets, because they are emerging markets, they're also seen as areas where you can make locally, and then it can be a backup for export if need be. But if you look at large domestic markets like Indonesia and India, they are actually meant for domestic production first, for satisfying the local domestic consumption. And I suspect in the US, that's probably going to be the case as well, right? For US and Mexico, more for domestic consumption rather than for export. If you look at some other countries in Southeast Asia, like Vietnam, which I'm sure many companies are talking about as well, right? Vietnam and Malaysia, then these are more export-oriented because those do not have large domestic markets by itself. So it's more of, okay, I make in a low-cost alternative country as a part of my diversification, and I use that to export out to the rest of the world. So so there are two strands to this, right? One is the domestic market, and then the other one is actually for export-oriented, which is the traditional global supply chain model that we are all used to. Now, I'll say the third trend that actually drives this is also technology, because in the past we didn't have enough, it's based on the low-cost labor cost, right? And then export out. But because of technology, right, automation and the use of 3D printing, blah blah blah, right? It's possible that some of these certain production can now be done, closer to the market, and that was not possible before. So some companies also splitting up their production. So there is a low-cost supply chain that is still in place, for the more stable demand. And there is the fast-moving type of supply chains that you actually do locally because it's possible to use automation or 3D printing or some kind of data-driven techniques to, be able to respond more quickly to customers. So I think it will not be a one-size-fits-all kind of supply chain. It will be focused on different products, different markets, and kind of like different supply chains targeting different types of markets and products.
Yeah. How I kind of, hello, mic check, thank you. How I distill some of that information back and translate it back to myself is just from that Southeast Asian context, there's going to be a lot of movement there, right? Not only for international, domestic consumption, not only for the fact that, it historically has been a low-cost region, but also balance, right? Security, and then technology. So there's going to be a lot more stresses, right, in that area, right? I mean, I kind of came up at a time where China was really the focus, right? And so we had to go through and kind of deal with all those things as China became more mature. So this would be kind of similar motions, although Southeast Asia, I think, is more mature than China was when maybe I started getting involved in it. But definitely getting to a level of maturity and stress testing that system, because there's going to be a lot of stress on that system, right? From a people, technology, process, capability standpoint, right? So I guess just kind of looking in the room, the cohort here, how many of you guys are thinking about, something related to supporting Asia or Southeast Asia, right? Just based on what PG said, I'm curious. That's concerning. So, all right, good point. So Guy, we gonna kind of continue on the global balance bit, and maybe I'll preface. I mentioned IDM 2.0. I'm a former Intel employee, right? So IDM is integrated device manufacturing, right? Yep. Okay. Intel not only designs chips but manufactures chips, and now they're going to become a foundry externally, like can I say it? Like a TSMC. And they're pumping $150 billion in manufacturing to meet that demand. So when we say IDM 2.0, that's part of the strategy. Guy's team is enabling that huge responsibility there. So when you think about, again, global balance, what Frank said, what PG said, from your perspective, what are some of the things that folks in the room should be thinking about, maybe keep you up at night, areas of help needed?
All right, can you hear me? Hello, hello? Yep? No?
Mike, guys.
Mike? There you go. So, excellent question, Ravi.
I just made it up on the fly.
Yeah, very good. That's pretty good. So when I think about that question, two things come to mind immediately. One is, everybody knows the saying of, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And when you tweak that for the semiconductor business, maybe it's don't put all your chips in one basket. And I'm not referring to the French fry type chips. And the other thing I think about is the ecosystem. So everybody, I've heard other speakers here talk about, you mentioned it about 20 times in the last 10 minutes. But the ecosystem is really, really important and key when, not just for the semiconductor industry, but I'll focus on that. And those are the two things, first of all, that I think about. And in our business, something amazing has happened over the past 2 decades. A country called Taiwan, anchored by two fantastic companies, TSMC and then Samsung, really have become the center for the majority of the world's supply of advanced semiconductor chips, which is amazing. And they've done it by developing the ecosystem in Taiwan. So, when you talk about an ecosystem in this industry, you're talking about the ability to manufacture the chips, the ability to assembly and test for the chips, the ability to do advanced packaging for the chips. You're talking about equipment suppliers. You're talking about raw material suppliers. You're talking about the service industry. It's a whole complex, right? I mean, think about a mall, right? You have an anchor, Macy's, or maybe today less so with the malls, but at least I'm a little bit older, used to be. You used to have like an anchor big box, and then you have all these other stores around it, and that's basically similar. And so today, Taiwan's become this amazing ecosystem supplying, majority of the world's semiconductors, advanced semiconductors, which is great for Taiwan. But on the other hand, at the same time, the demand for these products has skyrocketed and will continue to skyrocket. So whether 10 years ago the buzzword was IoT or big data, and now it's AI, it doesn't matter. It's all the same in terms of the need for this power, for the CPUs, for the chips. And that is just going to continue and continue to grow and grow and grow. So on the one hand, you have this demand that continues to grow. On the other hand, it's coming from one ecosystem. Now, you don't have to be, it actually is rocket science and science fiction to manufacture the chips, but anybody can understand that that equation doesn't hold over time. That's not sustainable. And so what you need to do, and this is what's going to happen, is you need to develop competing ecosystems. And so you'll have companies like Intel, for example, but others as well, that'll be the anchors developing these ecosystems in new areas of the world. And those new areas of the world initially are going to be here in North America, US, North America, and then in Europe, and specifically in the EU. And that's basically what's happening, what's going to happen. So eventually, in the next 5, 6, 7, 8 years, you'll have at least 3 competing ecosystems in this industry, which is going to be beneficial for everybody. Especially when we just came out of the pandemic, and you see what happens when you're fully reliant on one ecosystem. And again, that doesn't matter what industry you're in, that doesn't work. So you need to have these competing ecosystems, and that's basically what's going to happen here over the next few years. And for those of you here, students that are going to be in the supply chain, and in one way, shape, or form in this industry that I'm talking about, you're in the right place, in the right time, and you're going to have an opportunity to really influence the development of these ecosystems, especially here in the US. So it's going to be very exciting, and enjoy the ride.
Yeah, no, that's great. We used to say supply chain, and still say supply chain is a competitive advantage, right? And delineate that further. Your supply chain is a competitive advantage, but it's really your ecosystem supply chain, right? It's not what you control or what you buy. You got to think about all the people that are feeding you and what they control and what they buy, and kind of that ecosystem, right? And then how do you catalyze that to benefit you to then become a competing ecosystem against somebody else? So, that's really telling. And I think that, if you're on the supplier side, right, it's kind of a Me Too game, right? I'm using some of the same truckers and some of the same, airlines, but how do you take those relationships and really catalyze that in a way that it becomes a competing ecosystem that is better than whoever you're competing against, right? So that's really great stuff. Perry, what'd you eat for breakfast today, man?
What's that? Blueberry muffin, I think.
Just try to keep it light.
Yeah.
All right. So, look, I think you, also play in the space from a standpoint of you run construction supply chains, right? I mean, those categories fall within you, within your control. Where's the help needed, right? We've talked about kind of, how we got there and some of the things we're challenged with, but where's the help needed?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing that even Gene and company talked about this morning, and Frank as well, is just foundational aspect of supply chain knowledge is kind of the barrier to entry, right? It's table stakes. Optimizing on cost, optimizing on 100% OTD. Those are 15, 20 years ago, right? Those are those problems. The keynote talked about AI, generative machine learning, and models, and I think that's where, as supply chain experts, we have to be much more adept at model-based problem solving. And so you talked about optimizing. Anytime you make a decision of what's important, you're sub-optimizing something. And the more we can talk to our stakeholders about how we've thought about their problem, we have domain expertise that we can bring to bear, as well as outside in to our companies to solve the problems that they're looking for. Because it's much more now about using data, using AI, using machine learning to really stress test your models, to really stress test what options you're coming up with for potential stakeholder problems. because it's not enough just to have, hey, here's the cost optimized solution. Well, what about on-time delivery? Oh, well, yeah, here's that solution.
Yeah.
You need to blend it and try to balance all of those things. ESG is becoming a huge component of it. I did see the electrified truck out there, but I mean, that's something, every big company has some net zero goal. Some as close as 5 years away, right? So what does that mean? And how do you put that variable into your optimization? And I think that's where using that data, using that insight, we have to become much more influenceable, if you will.
Yeah.
That's not the right word, but we have to be able to influence
Yeah.
much more better with our stakeholders in the C-suites. The industry I'm in is facilities and construction, taking on professional services. Facilities is way ahead of construction, just in terms of the use of model-based problem solving, AI to solve some of their logistics problems as well. And construction, yes, it can be very complex. We worked on deals where we're thinking about moving, whole generator sets from Asia in one piece and modular pieces. And so the integration of the supply chain, the integration of information and data, and understanding how that flows and what's responsible for each party is vitally important. And construction is coming, whether it's virtual design or whether it's building information modeling. The facilities themselves have taken an ESG look with LEED, which started,
Yep.
decade plus ago. But now with some of the regulations coming in the space in terms of, low carbon cement, or what is a carbon footprint, mass timber buildings. I mean, we're even talking, this is in the public, I mean, many of the data center providers are thinking about how do I use mass timber in a data center, and you're gonna go, wait a minute, you think about all the electricity going to the building, and you've got wood. How does that work from a fire perspective? So these are problems that we're trying to figure out. How do we bring the right partners in and bring that into our stakeholders to solve some of these challenges?
Good. I think there's three things that I'll probably just highlight. One is construction's messy, right? So if anybody here is thinking about what part of the supply chain they want to go out and enable, that seems to be a great area and a great area of need. I myself have gravitated towards that. So
it's ripe with opportunity. I think it's just, there's been studies, I think it was probably 10 years ago, where they showed the productivity index of various companies. Manufacturing, I think, was way on top, obviously.
Yeah.
But construction flatlined, I think, since the 50s. Outside of I think the niche, bricklaying robots that you see down in Australia, the next tectonic change in the construction industry is really about how do they model, how do they use that information, how do they make sure the supply chain is as efficient as it can be.
Yeah, good. The other thing that kind of sticks out to me, and I hope it was, heard, was your ability to influence. All right. So, you've got to find the data. You have to have the technology. You have to have all those bells and whistles, right? But if you can't go out and enable something with that, then it's useless, right? And so, I'm not talking about soft skills, right? I'm not talking about your salesmanship, although that, sometimes helps. It's your ability to really understand what stakeholders are thinking, what their stakeholders are thinking, what game they're playing, right? I mean, it's kind of all of those things. And so, I've been around situations where you knew what the answer was, and everybody kind of knew what that answer should be, but whatever mechanism was trying to go out and influence it just couldn't do it. So, as a help needed, I think that's something to pay attention to.
I had somebody on my team one point said, I don't know if I believe it or not, but there's evidence there that says data only influences sideways and down.
Yeah.
And to have data influence up, you've got to have that connective tissue of, so what?
Yep.
Why do I care? So it's so much more about just the data and presenting on that, what are the trends, what are the things that could be optimized on. It's really about, and this is why you care.
Yep. Message noted. John, so you're on the other side of the house, right? You're,
That's right.
Service provider, and you've been in that game a long time, and you see yourself, you see your competitors, you see the ecosystem. If you're writing checks, where would you double down? Where would you invest? Where would you, influence folks on the other side to invest?
Well, it's certainly fun from our side of things. I work for a logistics provider, so on the technology side. So we spend a lot of time implementing data platforms and integration projects with some of the the best supply chains in the world and maybe some not so great supply chains, and you kind of see the inner workings of those implementations. And you know, the kind of areas of focus that I've noticed that really set strong supply chains ahead of the competition is collaboration, integration, and agility. The best supply chains are really focused on that consciously. And obviously, if you're a supplier or a logistics provider or a carrier that's trying to get a piece of the supply chain and participate in that, your job is to make investments to enable those things so that you can help the brands and manufacturers be better at what they're trying to do. On the collaboration side of things, it's been said a few times today. A supply chain, there's an end goal to service a customer, to get a product to an end customer at the right time. But that supply chain is made up of individual companies that are working in concert to achieve that goal, but they all have their own self-interest. They're all trying to maximize their own profit. So the best supply chains in the world are really good at finding incentives to make those participants collaborate effectively. It could be in financial incentives, it could be contractual requirements, supplier management programs, data platforms. But really it's about transparency and trust, because if you have individuals that are kind of trying to optimize their own situation, sub-optimize, as Ravi mentioned, the end goal is always going to not be optimized. One of the things that supports collaboration, obviously, is integration. And integration of process, integration of data. And in 2023, I think the state of integration in our industry is still pretty terrible, honestly. There's a lot of legacy systems, especially on the carrier side, but certainly on the shipper and the logistics provider side as well. And lots of legacy integrations, old EDI implementations that were implemented 27 years ago that no one wants to touch. And it's really blocking a lot of optimization and creating a lot of blind spots. So I think that's certainly an area of investment, both from the provider side and from the brand side as well. It is improving. There's great data sources available now that everyone can buy that potentially can tell you where a container's at right now, and if you're lucky, using a machine learning model when it will arrive. And we're seeing some improvements in accuracy over at least what the carriers used to predict. Maybe we've gone from a 60% accuracy of vessel arrival to a 75% accuracy or something like that, at least now. It was a different story a year or two ago with all the congestion, but it is improving. However, there's still a complete disconnect in a lot of cases between shipment visibility, let's say, and the SKUs in the brand's ERP. How do you correlate, that when that container is going to arrive to an order or a SKU or even a bill of material? Because it's likely you have this huge flow of components coming in that are going to get manufactured into finished good, and your demand is at a finished good level. So there's really not a whole lot of providers and brands in the industry that really made that work perfectly yet. It's a really hard problem to solve. And that's something that's, I think, a huge opportunity for people that want to solve that problem. And finally, agility. Frank mentioned that. That's key. I think agility is the kind of the key differentiator for supply chains in the next 5 years. The ability to capitalize on opportunities very quickly or to respond to disruptions faster than your competitors can. Cultivating that is super important. You can only do that with great data and kind of incentivized collaboration. And the value of that, it allows you to not only kind of understand the web of dependencies in your increasingly complex supply chain so you can work around problems and get product where it needs to go, but also start to take advantage of kind of consumer-driven product development where everything's on demand, which is becoming more and more prevalent, and it only will get more popular with generative AI, I think. And we're going to see products being developed very quickly, maybe potentially responding to algorithms. If you stop on your vertical feed on your phone, that's going to be a demand signal to not only position that inventory, but to develop that product. And if providers or brands can kind of position themselves in a way to really react very quickly and adapt, self-heal, et cetera. Huge amount of value, huge amount of opportunity there. So I think both, the suppliers, providers that are focused on this, it's investment in those areas to really drive that.
Hey, can I add on to
Yeah.
John? And John, that's a great point. I think one of the things from the supply chain professional side that I don't think is as appreciated as much is if you want to transact business, you'll get transactional outcomes. And I think the partnership and that trust and transparency you talked about, John, is so vitally important to going solving some of the problems. So a partnership sometimes needs a couples therapist, and I think supply chain executives and the professionals, you almost have to have that skill to be able to not only broker deals, externally, but even internally as well.
Right. Yeah, good points. I would say, as a former freight forwarder, I always think my customers would call me a partner when times are bad. And when times are good, hey, it's go transact, right? But you're right? That's where we need to go. And I think, C-suite, we kind of hear this thing, we realize how important supply chain is. I don't think we realize is the case. We've finally listened, right? Like this. But yeah, I think on that point, Perry, that partnership and how you maintain a transactional and a partnership relationship is important. And the kind of one thing, John, I wanted to touch on was that incentivization, right? I mean, you can, when I think of those things, I always go to performance penalties, right? Maybe I'm a glass half empty guy, but how you incentivize and how you get people and how you pay them more to transact and things like that, I think that's probably where the industry's going. So,
I will say that if anybody here, though, is able to develop Star Trek Beam Me Up Scotty technology, then you'll solve all these problems. And then probably need to look for a different line of work. But until then, lots of challenges.
Well, my question was going to be, where do you guys see things evolving, right? So maybe not from a company standpoint, but just an individual supply chain professional, 2025-ish, like what would have evolved by then? Beam me up, Scotty.
Well, that's the technology, but assuming that that doesn't happen in the next 5 years, in terms of the skill sets, I think Perry hit on it. Frank as well. I mean, I think it's if it used to be, certain skill sets around being able to understand on-time delivery or understand cost, it's just getting more and more with more complexity, and more things need to be taken into account. So you really need to be, on the one hand, a generalist in understanding logistics, transportation, planning, forecasting, across the board. On the other hand, also be able to really understand those pillars deep.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's not enough to just know a little bit about each of those or know a lot about one of those. You really have to know about all of those, both wide and deep. And I think that's not easy.
Yeah.
And that's different maybe from the past.
So your view of evolution as a supply chain professional will have access to more data, which will enable them to be able to go deep and wide, right? And the tools and things like that, right?
One would hope.
Yeah. Okay. Frank?
Just to add on to that, and all of this has really already been said in the holistic conversation, but I want to dig deeper on two aspects. One is the responsible procurement aspect. And again, as we kind of think about the core foundational things that we need, the agility, the capability that it gets enabled and alignment to the trends toward reshoring, et cetera, we have to understand the evolution of our accountability when it comes to responsible supply chains. Historically, obviously, a lot of the focus, when you talk about the zero emissions goals, it's been on scope 1 and scope 2. But now there's been a lot more emphasis on scope 3, where we're having to be accountable for the emissions that are generated by the partners that we work with. And if you look at the stuff that the SEC is doing and trending toward requiring companies to report, public companies to report, that's going to be a really key thing. Another key thing that's connected to that we talked a lot about is really the relationships. Because you have to have trusted engagements and partnerships And that's going to be more and more the case. And when I talk about that trust, it's really a function of the fact that our supply chains are integrated supply chains. You're only as good as the weakest link. And we have to get to a space when people are so restrictive in terms of information flow because of the fact that they're concerned about how my partner may use that against me. Those relationships generate trust. That trust generates the transparency. That transparency generates the openness to drive the innovation that's going to be required to allow us to enable the robust supply chains that we ultimately need to put in place.
That's great. I'm going to pause you guys for a sec because we're got about 14 minutes and I want to take some questions. So we got a couple of WOVA questions here, but before I get into that, anybody want to stand up and ask a question? Yeah. Ravi, I like your name. Do you want to maybe grab a mic? Ravi first.
All right.
Go ahead.
Question for you. I heard PG talk about India, Indonesia, and Vietnam being beneficiaries of decoupling from China, essentially. And I heard Guy talk about the importance of decoupling in the semiconductor industry for strategic purposes. But both of these depend on the resources and capabilities available in the countries that you're talking about. So for example, in India or Indonesia, low-cost labor is still the driving force. So you can take out manufacturing of assembly work there from China. But you cannot take the other parts of the supply chain, which is deep technology issues, where India cannot produce your IC semiconductor chips, or neither can Indonesia. So you can only take parts of that supply chain to decouple from the Chinese environment at this point in time. At least that's what I see, and I'd like to pose that as a question to you. Second, in terms of what Guy talked about, yes, strategically, the US and Europe want the semiconductor fabs that they envy Taiwan about. I've been with Taiwan since 1989. I've talked to Morris Chang and TSMC and how they developed that. When you try to bring them into US or Europe, as people are putting money into this, one, can you construct these fabs in fast enough time periods with the capabilities of clean rooms and machine equipment needed? Can you do that? Because do you have the building capabilities in this country or Europe to do that? Second, the technician, human resource capabilities of running these fabs. Now, you can do that in Taiwan because they have two universities producing technicians to support this industry. Where do we have that in the US? Wherever, even Arizona, where you want to plan to put it, where do you have the resources to do that? That's about my question. So can you answer those 2 points?
Sure. Maybe I can just touch a little bit. I agree that a lot of the supply chain or the value chain or the manufacturing is very much assembly right now based on low cost. And in fact, if you look at even a few years ago, right, before all this talk about relocation came along, companies like Xiaomi, which makes mobile phones, they went to India and they were very successful. And what they found was that they had to import all the components. So even when Intel went to Vietnam in the early days, they had to import all the components. And a lot of these electronic companies, what they've done is that they actually get the suppliers to import, right? And then they do the assembly. And it's only over a period of time that they can build up the manpower and the supply base. So talking about the supply ecosystem, it takes time to build up. And that's also, in a way, like talking, when we, sometimes when I tell my students, right, this is where the opportunity is, because the supply chain changes will take 5 years, 10 years, 15 years to take place. It's not going to be overnight, So there's a lot of aspiration, but, and I'm not going to talk about it now, but I could actually prove that the first talk about relocation was in 2008, when oil prices were high, and nearshoring, and this was 2008. But it takes such a long time for all these things to happen. So in a way, it's also opportunities for supply chain professionals, right, and the students that, it's going to be a long process, with the digitalization, with the reshoring and with the changes that are happening. And it's not only about technology, it's also about sourcing for new locations, looking for, where the suppliers, going to the site, so how do you decide where to go? Is it, if it's in the US, which state is it going to be in? If you're going to Vietnam or you're going to India, which province or which state is it going to be in? There's a lot of discussion on government incentives. There's a lot of time taken even for construction, for 2 years or 3 years of the building to take place. And then, so after the building has happened, right, then the manufacturing starts, and then that's when you talk about manpower. So that whole transition itself is a 5, 10 year, 15 year process, and, so when we talk about, the other point I'll say is that when you talk about relocation, and we talk about diversification, right, and this is really what it means to diversify. So it's not going to be like, okay, we are going to move totally from one place to another place, but really it's about moving, to a couple of different or multiple baskets, right, and not having the chips in one basket, and the paradigm for that, right, is, I'll share a story, is that I went shopping over the weekend recently, just over this weekend, over here. So I went to Macy's, H&M, right, and I was buying clothes, and and I was looking at the labels, right, because I was just buying clothes. Actually, I was looking at the prices, but then because you look at the prices, it says made in what countries, right? And so you see made in China, and then you also see made in Bangladesh, which I didn't see as much before, and then you see made in Indonesia, right? So that's my paradigm of what sourcing would look like in future. It's going to be like multiple countries. It's not going to be like, a single source,
And that's what we're talking about, global balance, right?
Yeah.
Trying to balance that out. So I think Perry and Guy, if you just want to address what you can in a minute.
Yeah, so I think, you raise very good points, right? So you need to have, I talked about the ecosystem, I was talking about manufacturing and suppliers, but it's much wider than that, right? It's the banking system, it's the tax and regulation system, it's the government support, it's the labor market, it's the higher education, right? It's everything, right? The good news is that in the US, you have that. So I know that because Intel's been doing that for 70 years. Now, Intel's been building fabs in the US for 70 years. It's not like it's something new. In Europe, when you talk about Europe, I love Greece. I love going there on vacation. Does Greece have the infrastructure you're talking about? No. But Germany does, Poland does, France does, the Benelux region absolutely does. You're talking about companies, huge companies, right? Not necessarily that are making microchips today, but in different industries, right? Whether that's Schneider, or whether that's Siemens, or whether that's ABB, or whether that's Shell, or whatever, right? There's tons of industry. So the infrastructure exists in those countries that you can build off of. So I think there's a starting point there and here, and absolutely. There's no reason I see that the infrastructure is already in place to do that.
No, I think that's why the CHIPS Act was there. That's why the CHIPS Act had money, included in there for education as well as the European component. But I think that the one thing is, several of us on the stage were probably in Vietnam at one point in time when they were teaching process control by building bicycles. So it's a journey, as PG says. I know you're shaking your head in terms of saying I don't agree with you, or just in general, because I think. I live in Arizona. TSMC is building up north. That's public. But you should see all the Sumitomo, AMAT, ASML. So it's an ecosystem that comes to rally around important clients.
Yep. I'm going to take a question from the back of the room.
So this is Ishan. I'm from this cohort student. I hold in my hand an article from US Patents Office. It says Amazon files a patent for 3D printing delivery trucks. So I think this will reimagine the supply chain in terms of, as we were talking about, resilience and disruption. And again, the forecasting and stuff that we do will be more about raw material, because finished good can be produced then and there. So I just wanted to get some views on this. Like how is the disruption coming, or how do you assume, or your perception on this?
I think it's a great data point. that supports everything we've been talking about.
Actually,
right?
yes.
And by the way, too, and just to add on to the other conversation, I think that's the other piece, too, to think about is the role of technology, right? You have certain things where you've got a concentration of manufacturing, as an example, that's a function of the labor intensity. But I think we shouldn't forget about the advancement of robotics and other technologies that will ultimately enable, even in greenfield places, things to be built that couldn't be built there before. It'll take time, it's not easy, but I think technology is an enabler to allow us to do some of the things that we're trying to do.
In that terms, there was one thing that I also wanted to check. So factory of America is said to be China, Vietnam, all the ASEAN countries. So with this thing in place, 3D printing trucks traveling through the streets, which can then print your order then and there and deliver it to you in like 5 minutes. So the supply chain will be impacted. Like they'll be redesigned, redefined. So that was one thing that I wanted to really build upon, because in start of career, I think I should, to redesign or redefine stuff, the networks, I should be knowing these things about what you are thinking on factory of the American industries. Like,
I mean,
because
do you guys just from a show of hands, right? I know where you're coming from. Do you see that 3D printing on the fly in trucks impacting general supply chain in the next couple of years? Because that would be the relevant, right?
yeah.
I do,
Yeah.
right? And again, unless you pay a lot of attention to it, a lot of that activity is already happening.
Yeah.
There's 3D printing, when you think about things that require a lot of, for instance, logistics capacity, costs, when you think about the ESG-related things, right? Large form factor things, people are 3D printing houses,
Yeah.
a lot of things today. And I think over time, you just see that continue to advance as the technology continues to evolve. There's a lot of value.
Cool.
Maybe I can give a little bit of
Sure.
statistic.
And we do have 4
yeah.
minutes.
Okay,
Yep.
so yeah, just a quick one. So 3D printing accounts for 0.1% of manufacturing today, and it's growing by 30%, but it's growing from a very small base. So if you talk about next 2 years, it won't have any visible impact, but 15, 20 years later, then it may have some impact on how production is done.
Yeah.
Cool.
Okay.
That answers it. Thank you.
All right. So I think I'm going to end it with, again, focused on the up-and-coming supply chain superheroes here. Just going down the list, guys, some career advice. Up-and-coming folks getting into supply chain. I don't know, I'll start with John and just kind of work way down. What's your advice, John?
Well, I'm the data guy. Data is a really valuable skill in modern supply chain. The AI is great on paper if you have good data, high data quality, which the industry generally doesn't have yet. So any kind of fundamental data skills, data engineering, data analysis, the ability to understand the larger context of data and how it plays into the end-to-end value stream is super important. So the combination of analytical skills and supply chain domain knowledge is super valuable right now, and that's going to get us to really actioning data, which there's a lot of reasons that data can't be actioned right now. And we're still struggling with this descriptive analytics, to be honest, in a lot of cases, trying to objectively describe what happened in the past. And in a lot of cases, we're nowhere near doing predictive or prescriptive analytics yet. So it's really kind of about plumbing and maybe not so sexy kind of data skills for now. That's going to lead to massive career opportunities in the future as AI and data strategies blossom.
Thanks, John.
Yeah, I would say the desire and focus on continuing to learn. When you think about supply chain, as we talked about, it's become a thing over the last several years. But it's a function that just continues to evolve. What it is today is different than what it was 10 years ago, than what it was 20 years ago. If you were to ask 5 people what supply chain, you'll likely get 5 different answers. It will continue to evolve, and I think that's an exciting thing. There's a lot of complexity and a lot of opportunity to solve for that complexity.
I'd say don't be afraid to do something different. Learn more about different spaces. I happened into supply chain maybe 12 years ago. I started in finance, was in construction and facilities operations for a while. But to what Frank was saying is I always moved, and it was, by the way, lateral. There was no promotions involved. So be willing to take a chance just to go learn. Not everything needs to be upward all the time.
Thanks.
I'll say that besides technology, also think about the physical aspects of the supply chain. So, where to build the factories, how to negotiate for tax incentives, where to find the sources for the supplies. And, these are also strategic skills that would be
Strategy.
needed.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, I would say, like everything else, obviously, find your passion. But again, what I was saying before about being broad and deep, like if you have an opportunity, try to taste different parts. Try to get into tax and trade. Try to get into procurement. Taste a little bit of logistics. Taste a little bit of warehousing, transportation, planning, strategy. The more knowledge you have across the supply chain, the more value you'll be able to bring wherever you find yourselves at the end of the day.
Nice, yeah. And if I could give one, I would just say, know the game you guys are playing, right? Trying to figure out if you're playing the right game, and that connects ultimately to what your stakeholders are driving. So understand the game first, play it well, find people that can role model to help you play that game really well. So, hey, thank you guys. Much appreciated. Think you guys can enjoy lunch now.
Thank you, Ravi and gang.